Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video lecture for Philosophy 101. Tonight we've got some more to do on personal identity, and we got more to do on Perry. We talked about this psychological continuity theory today at the very end of class. I was giving you a definition of what's going on with that theory, but we also need to evaluate it. It's got a bunch of problems with it, and articulating exactly what is the issue here with the theory and what is it going to have to do to deal with that is going to be very important. Not only because the psychological continuity theory is probably, I'd say, the most popular theory of identity on the market today, so to speak, among most contemporary philosophers. Locke's memory psychological continuity theory, that's the one that really has the most purchase. And it's also the one that Parfit is going to be working off of. So Parfit's really going to insert himself right into the conversation on the psychological continuity thing and the problems that it's fraught with, and what we can do about that. So that's what I mostly want to focus on tonight, making sure that we've got that theory down and we've explored these dynamics with it, these possible objections and possible replies. And then I want to kind of take stock and see where we're at. The stuff that's happening in the third night of the Perry reading, we actually touched on a bunch of the interesting points that are coming up in that section today in class this morning. So I'm thinking I might just want to transition right into doing a little bit of Parfit. I want to kind of see how much time we have once we get through talking about psychological continuity and Perry, and see, and if there is a good chunk of time, I'm just going to go right into Parfit, I think. If we're it's already been like, I don't know, maybe 40 minutes or something, and we're just wrapping up with psychological continuity, then I don't know, I might make a judgment call, might call an audible here, and just maybe check in with people in the chat and see how they're understanding what's going on here with the Perry stuff, rather than trying to throw some more Parfit in. And maybe I just give a little introduction to Parfit tonight. But I think in any event, I think Parfit's going to take more attention next week. So we're going to spend some time next week doing Parfit, rather than just kind of glossing over him quickly and moving on. Because Parfit's got a lot of really interesting things going on, and he's the first example you guys are going to see of really paradigmatic contemporary analytic philosophy. So I don't want to do him too quickly. I don't want to gloss over him too quickly. So that's kind of the game plan for tonight. I've got even more diagrams to draw again on my Dinosaur Comics whiteboard, so bear with me again on that. Maybe I'll find a whiteboard here one of these days. All right, so let's just kind of get down on the table again what the psychological continuity theory is saying about personal identity. Remember that unlike the soul theory and the materialism theory, psychological continuity is not saying that identity is about some part of you. It's not about possessing a certain thing. It's not about this substratum sort of thing, whether that substratum was a material substance, the body stuff, or it was this spiritual substance, this mental substance, the soul. So instead, the psychological continuity theory is saying that a person is like a series of events, like a continuous stream of consciousness that's taking place. And we'll be able to see the connections of that stream of consciousness through certain types of mental episodes. The most notable ones are memories, because memories are sort of connecting me with these past stages of consciousness that are kind of putting it into a kind of unity that allows me to kind of track my identity through time. When Locke in the reading, Perry mentions this in the reading. Locke is the one that we're really looking at for this theory. He's kind of the first person to really formulate this concept into a nice pinned down thesis. And Locke's inspiration for this, like his what led him to guess that maybe psychological continuity is what identity consists in, is just the observation that I have access to my own experiences through memory, but I don't have access to yours. So it seems like we're different people, because I can remember the things that happened to me, and I can't remember your experiences. So maybe memory and what happens there is sort of like a way of tracking my existence through time. So again, I want to remind you that the way this is going to work.
Yo.
Hey, what's up, Tommy? So the way this is going to work is that as long as there is an unbroken chain here, then I'm the same person. If there's a break in the chain, then we've got two different things. So think about identity on the psychological continuity theory as like the object of the whole chain with all of its links. Now, I'm going to draw another picture here, kind of similar to the one I drew this morning. So here's here we'll use the top line here. This is like a timeline, right? And here's today. Here I'm born, and then there's all these other things in between. Okay, so here we go. We got today, we got when I was born, and then here's the timeline. And today, I can remember all sorts of things about stuff that happened to me in the past. I might not be able to remember, say, the dream I had last night. Let's say, nope, can't remember the dream I had last night. Can't do that. But I can remember what happened to me last week, or maybe like 10 years ago, and so on and so forth. And I also am not able to remember what happened to me when I was born. So it's not like I've got total access to all of my conscious experiences through time. I remember some of them, but not others. But here's the key. I'm able to remember maybe something that happened to me 10 years ago. And 10 years ago, I could remember something that happened to me earlier than that. And at that moment, I was able to remember things earlier and earlier, leading up all the way to maybe just the moment to moment sort of short-term memories that I'm having from when I'm born all the way through today. There's an unbroken chain of these, even though there's some links that are hanging. Like sometimes I draw it like this. You've got a chain, right? But then there's like certain links that didn't get linked up. They got broken. But there's still some sort of chain that's holding the whole thing together and making it into one object. And that's how psychological continuity understands personal identity. And here's a question from Lawrence. So you're wanting to save this one for later, but actually I'm not sure whether I do want to save it for later. Yeah, so the reason why I don't want to save this is that Lawrence's question has to do again with the difference between a theory being able to explain to us what identity consists in and whether or not what identity consists in is something that's going to be knowable for us. So psychological continuity, and this is something that's going to be very, very important for the psychological continuity theory. That's why I want to definitely talk about it now. So the theory is saying that identity consists in this unbroken stream of consciousness. That's a person, is that whole stream of mental episodes, not the underlying substratum, but just the sequence of these experiences and rememberings and that sort of thing. Those psychic connections that tie the stream of consciousness together, make it a unified stream. Now, I can't see your mind, and I can't see whether the stream has continued or something like that. So in some ways you might say like, well, this is maybe going to fall into the same sort of problems that the soul theory had, that I'm not able to know whether someone else is the same person or not, because what identity consists in is not something I'm capable of knowing about. But this is where again I think there's that kind of same body, same soul kind of principle like Miller was using to try to save the soul theory. The problem was that souls were essentially unknowable, like I can't even detect them at all. But I can maybe detect memories. Like I can ask people if they remember things or stuff like that, or at least these are the kinds of existences that I can in principle have some kind of contact with, at least with myself. I'm able to know I have direct experiences with my own memories. Definitely have that. So then I can think, well, your body is kind of like mine, and you probably have conscious experiences like mine, and you probably also have memory experiences like mine. And I don't remember having episodes that didn't happen within this body, so maybe that's true for you too. And so there's a kind of analogy that happens here. But as Daniel points out here, false memories are a big problem for the psychological continuity theory. So just hang off on that. I'm going to get there in a second. But this is why this matters, why we need to talk about how we could have knowledge of identity under the context of the psychological continuity theory of identity. That is going to be a major point here. But I think that this idea of drawing analogy from myself to other people would allow me to maybe make judgments that have some degree of accuracy. They're kind of like, maybe I don't have total certainty about it, but maybe knowledge doesn't require total certainty. In fact, most accounts of what are the standards of knowledge don't require that. They require something just short of that. So maybe I've got an informed guess here, and that's good enough to license my ability to make judgments about identity with other people. But that is all dependent on my ability to have an understanding of my own identity. And when it comes to my memories, I'm kind of in a difficult situation here because I have memory-seeming experiences, but it may not be the person that I'm remembering as having a certain experience may not be me. Okay, that might sound a little weird. Let me explain what I mean. If the memory theory is saying that if I have these connections of memory, here, that's kind of washed out. Okay, there you go. If I have these connections of memory, then the person that I'm remembering, the person who's had this experience is me. If I'm remembering it, then it's me. So you might now ask the very sensible question: what if I have memories of being Napoleon? Does that mean I'm Napoleon? Like I have some memory experience of the Battle of Waterloo. Does that mean that I'm Napoleon? Doesn't seem like it. Seems like it's possible for me to have fake memories or false memories. That I have this memory-seeming experience, but it actually doesn't fit in with the person. Like I'm not the person who had the experience that I'm having this memory experience of. Maybe it's just my imagination. Maybe it's a hallucination or something else. So there's an immediate need for the psychological continuity theory to adjust its theory to say that it's not just having some kind of memory episode that makes you the same person, but they have to be authentic memories. They can't be fake memories. Okay, so it might look like there's this problem for psychological continuity theory, but then psychological continuity theory has this like quick answer for it. But then it's a like not so fast sort of a moment here, because the next question is how to define what an authentic memory is. How do we tell the difference between a fake memory and an authentic memory? And the reason this is a problem, why this question is a problem for the theory, is that there's an initial temptation to answer the question, well, the memory is an authentic memory if the person who had that experience is you. But that answer is not going to work very well for the psychological continuity theory of memory or of identity, and let me show you why. So let's take our little timeline and make it a little simpler. I'm going to draw this up for a second, so bear with me. Okay, so here's our timeline. Oops, sorry, guys. So here is now when I'm having a memory-seeming experience. And here is last week, where there's an event that is being remembered. And this memory-seeming experience is referencing this event. So it refers to this. And if we want to say that my memory is an authentic memory, if the person who had this experience is the same person as the one who's remembering it, we're going to have a circular explanation of identity. Because let's go back to our little A's and B's model. I've got personal identity here, and I want an explanation of personal identity, And we're going to now say, well, you can explain identity in terms of memory. But then there's a question, what's memory? Oh, well, I can give you a theory of memory that unfortunately relies on personal identity again. So that's a circular argument. In any other setting, in any other context, it would be okay to talk about the difference between real memories and fake memories as a difference in identity, of whether the person who had the actual event happen to them and the person who's doing the remembering are same people or separate people. If I remember the Battle of Waterloo, well, the person who actually led the French forces in the Battle of Waterloo was Napoleon, a different dude than me, the person who's having the remembering experience. So it's not an authentic memory because we're different people. So if we're just having a philosophical discussion about memory, maybe that would be an okay answer. The problem here is that we're not just having a discussion about memory, we're having a discussion about memory in the context of trying to explain personal identity. So if I'm like, I can explain personal identity with memory, and then explain memory by personal identity, we're just in a circular loop here. That's not helping us, it's not giving us any insight here about what's really going on with either phenomenon. So if the psychological continuity theory of identity wants to vindicate itself, it's going to have to find some independent way of drawing the line between an authentic memory and a fake memory. It's got to make sure that its explanation of that distinction doesn't rely in any way on being the same person. Okay, we need to appeal to some sort of independent thing. Okay, I want to hold off on a second before I go further and see if there's any questions here by the people who are in the chat right now, which we have a lot of people tonight, which is great. Love that. So how are things going so far? This is when I really wish I had the class in front of me, because explaining this stuff is difficult, and there's some complicated relationships here about how this claim depends on this other claim, and getting into this like circular trap is a problem. How are we doing so far? Any clarifying questions you guys have? Okay, so Lawrence, you're wondering about how the psychological theory could determine if a memory is authentic or not when we're talking about hypnotic regression and seeming to have a past life. Um, the key thing to remember here again is that even with the demand that the psychological continuity theory give some sort of um, explanation or description of the distinction between a real and a fake memory, it doesn't have to tell us how we could know that. It just has to tell us what it would mean for it to be an authentic memory and what it would mean for it to be a fake memory. It doesn't have to. That's definitely going to be useful for being able to get started on trying to know it, but it doesn't have to ensure that it's possible for us to know it. Maybe only God knows whether it's a real memory or a fake memory. Maybe only some being like that could have the perspective necessary. Maybe this is a kind of reality that, while we know exists, is sort of hidden from us, and we won't be able to tell in any particular case. That's actually something that Vera complains about the psychological continuity theory, that if identity depends on this, that's also something that's not really possible for me to confirm to myself. In as much as I have difficulty telling whether my own memories are fake or authentic, I can't even know whether I'm the same person. But in some ways, this might be a virtue of the theory, because if we look at it intuitively, if I have reason to suspect that maybe false memories have been implanted in me, now I'm going to be a little more suspicious and hesitant about making a judgment that I am the same person. Think again, I keep promising Total Recall references, and this is a good one. Like in Total Recall, he's like, am I that person or not? Am I the person who had those experiences? Everyone's talking to me like I'm this other dude. Is that me? I don't know. I don't know whether the memory I'm having right now is a real one or a fake one. Was it implanted from that whole like go on this vacation and we'll give you the memories sort of thing? Or was it an experience that authentically happened to me? From the inside, we can't tell. Sure seems like there's a big problem for that. So I'd say I don't know how you're going to be able to tell whether hypnotic regression and having memories of a past life are authentic or not. I'm not sure where you could find the evidence to determine that. But I can give you a theory about what it would mean for them to be authentic or what it would mean for them to be fake, which we haven't gotten yet. We haven't gotten that story yet. At least the not circular one. I'm about to present that, but that's about probably the most that we're going to be able to hope for here. So let me know if that answers your question, Lawrence. And Daniel has another question. Nagging question from Parfit. No, this is not Q remembering, and I'm going to hold off on Parfit till later. Because Parfit is a whole nother can of worms. So maybe we'll get to him tonight. I don't think we'll probably get to Q remembering tonight. I'm pretty sure that won't happen, but it's coming soon. Just wait. It'd probably be great if we could talk on Monday together in class about Q memories, because they're kind of tricky to understand. Cool, awesome. I'm happy that answers your question, Lawrence. Any other clarifying questions here about the sort of dilemma that, or why the psychological continuity theory needs to have a distinction between authentic and fake memories, and why the explanation that a memory is authentic as long as the person who had the experience is the same person as the person who's doing the remembering, why that answer won't work for the theory, why that won't do a good enough job here, why it's objectionable. We're good? Cool. It's looking good. All right. If you guys got more questions, please feel free to interrupt more. I don't know, maybe I'm just paranoid about this stuff, but I think this is pretty tricky conceptual territory. Okay. So here's the best answer that historically it seems like or I guess this is maybe the most plausible or popular option. Maybe there's a better one out there. I don't know. Maybe it's not the best or not, but this is a pretty good answer. And a very natural answer for what's the difference between authentic memories and fake memories. We already have half of the puzzle right here. We know that when I'm having a memory seeming experience where, from the inside, a real memory and a fake memory look exactly the same. I'm like, but I remember it had this kind of quality of experience and everything. Like this happened and then that happened, and it all kind of, there's the logic of it right there. So I won't be able to tell, like, there won't be some special phenomenological mark of a real memory versus a fake memory. They're both going to feel exactly the same. So whatever is going to make the difference between them is probably not going to be something within the experience itself. But we know that every memory seeming experience is referencing some actual event, whether that's the Battle of Waterloo or what I had for dinner last night. There's some actual event that the remembering experience is like pointing my attention to or referring to. Okay? So the theory is going to propose this answer. A memory is authentic if the reason or cause for why I'm having the memory seeming experience, sorry, this is still washed out, guys. It's authentic as long as the cause of why I'm able to have the memory seeming experience is the thing that the memory refers to. So if it's this event that caused it's the experiential event I had in this moment is the cause for why I'm having the memory seeming experience now, then it's an authentic memory. If the cause and the reference don't line up, then it's a fake memory. So if my I'm sorry my whiteboard is so distracting with these dinosaurs, but you guys can read that, right? If the thing that the memory seeming experience is referring to is the same thing that causes the memory seeming experience, that's authentic. But let's just say my memory seeming experience is caused by insanity or maybe some like crazy drugs I took or something like that, then the thing that's causing the experience and the thing that is referred to by the memory experience are not the same thing. They haven't lined up. So that means it's fake. That's the difference. Notice how this causal connection has nothing to do with me being the same person. So this sort of way of drawing the line in the sand between authentic memory and a fake memory doesn't invoke the concept of personal identity at all, so we don't have this circularity problem anymore. The theory has found some independent ways of explaining what a memory is and what an authentic memory is. Okay, so that's their goal here, and it seems like they've done a pretty okay job with it. Does that basic proposal make sense? Yep, yep. Any questions? Cool. All right. If there are some, let's have them happen. Um, okay. So what should we talk about next? Um, there's there's a bunch of good things that get talked about here with the psychological continuity theory, but um, let's focus on this before we leave it behind. This is the last major landmark that I'd want to highlight here for the psychological continuity theory, because this is going to be a perfect lead into Parfit. Um, okay, so the psychological continuity theory is talking about identity being preserved as long as there is this like continuous stream of consciousness that's happening. Okay, and there can be some like memories that get lost and stuff like that, but as long as there's some unbroken chain, we're good. Now, what is the psychological continuity theory going to say about our original question? Remember, we were motivated to talk about personal identity in the first place because of some other issues. Um, we wanted to talk about, especially, survival. That was a major thing here. So there's a question: can me, whatever I am, survive the death of my body? And if me is psychological continuity, then what could that possibly look like? Maybe there's some way for me to be psychologically connected with the thing that died here on Earth with some other realm. And this is when they start talking about God making a heaven duplicate of me. So God makes like a heavenly body that then is connected in all of the right ways. Let's start here. So God makes a heavenly body that has memories of all of the things that happened to me on Earth. Okay, so first let's imagine one way that this could be happening that would probably not qualify here um, as me surviving. Like if God just makes some being and then and gives that being a bunch of memory seeming experiences that have as their content all of the things that happened to me in my life, well, that just might be a duplicate, like a totally separate object. It's not me. I can't anticipate. Remember this anticipation thought about survival, that I can't anticipate the experiences of that heaven being, that heavenly body being. Um, Even though it has memories that have the content of all my life, that might not be my stream of consciousness that like flowed into that thing. Okay, so if it was just like copying the data of all my memories into this other object, that wouldn't be me. If I could, let's say we're able to find a way to create robots that have consciousness, that they do have consciousness, artificial intelligence, true artificial intelligence, experiencing robots, and we find a way to encode all the kind of information that's located in memories. If I design a robot and upload all of my memories into it, that doesn't mean I've become immortal. It's not like that's transferred necessarily my consciousness. Just the information that's in my memories, that's not it. Okay, so that sort of thing wouldn't count as survival. But let's say, God's all powerful. That's why we throw him into these thought experiments, because he can do whatever he wants, as long as it's conceivable and not logically contradictory. That's really the reason why God comes up so much. He's supposed to be this omnipotent being, so basically it makes it possible that anything that is logically possible could actually happen. So that's usually why God comes up here, instead of having to like cook up some crazy other explanation for how these things could actually happen. Um, consistent with like the laws of nature we already know. Okay, I'm going on a tangent here. Maybe it's not useful. Let's get back to the point. Point here, let's say God is capable of creating a heavenly being, like another vessel for consciousness, and he has some way of connecting up my sort of consciousness into that thing. I mean, that's the kind of thing we'd have to be imagining if we're going to say that I survived the death of my body. And even if even if I don't have the same body anymore, maybe I've survived because that thing has authentic memories of the things that happened to me while I was in this body. But here's where things get tricky. What's the difference between those two cases? The case where God just makes a being that has all my memories, and the one where my consciousness, the stream of consciousness, has been able to be like funneled into this new heavenly body thing. What's the difference between those two things? It might be hard to articulate it. And this is where things get tricky for the answer that the psychological continuity theory has been giving us about authentic memories. It is nice and clear to say that there's a causal connection going on between the remembering experience and the original event, but here's the tricky thing. What kinds of causal connections count as authentic connections of the kinds that we're looking for authentic memories? Maybe some of the causal ways in which like God is linking the original event and encoding it like normal. Okay, let me slow down here. In a normal case, let's not think about God yet in the heavenly bodies. Just in a normal case, what is the causal connection between my memory seeming experience and the original event? Well, maybe it's something in my brain. Like my brain is able to process information and make it available for future use in some sort of way. Like there's this like I've got a hard drive in my brain and it's copying data to it and then I can access it later. So the information is being causally preserved through this entire temporal process, right? By some causal processes happening in my brain. Well, what's to stop other causal things as being the mechanism? Why does it have to be the brain? There's no good reason, at least in terms of the theory as it's stated so far. Maybe God can use these causal connections to hook up my heaven body to have a remembering experience that has this chain of causal connections going back to the original experience that I actually had, that this body Tim, the earthly body Tim had. Okay, so earthly body Tim had this experience. Heavenly body Tim is having the remembering. Maybe God, like my brain is encoding it all the way up until the point that my body dies, kaput. But then God syncs it up. He like puts some other causal framework in place to preserve that information, and then so that the heavenly body Tim can have access to it. Is that an authentic preserving of the crucial information of the memory? I mean, there's a question there. It's hard to figure out how to articulate. If you're going to say no, why no? And if you're going to say yes, why yes? I think, as far as I can think about this, both answers strike me as equally arbitrary. To say that it requires encoding in the brain, I don't buy that. There might be other ways that I can encode these sorts of things, and they can still be authentic rememberings. We're going to talk about some of the goofy ways in which this might happen, and so in this kind of post-human sort of context, when we get into Parfit, and especially when we talk about Q remembering. There's some science fiction examples I'll give you that are really not so far-fetched. They're right now they're science fiction, but they could very well be science reality, maybe even in some kind of timetable like the next 50 years. It's totally not out of the question that we could do some of these things. And I think that's if we, especially when we think about them being actually possible, and it's not just like some God experiment, that really starts to push our intuitive buttons a little bit more and makes us really think like, yeah, okay, I will have to deal with that. That's not just a possibility I can dismiss because it's so implausible that I'm not going to have to build that into my theory. And this is a point I've been wanting to make I've been trying to sneak in the last like 15 minutes. When we're talking about all these crazy thought experiments about what happens with like God making heaven bodies and stuff like that, I mean, there's a reason for it. Even though they might strike you as far-fetched, etc., there's a very important theoretical purpose to them, that they're pushing our theories to the limit, saying, okay, well, here's just a set of circumstances. What is the theory of personal identity going to say about identity in these circumstances? And even though they're crazy circumstances, they teach us something about what the theory is saying even under normal circumstances. About like what is it that's going on in the normal circumstance that makes it work out in the way that we find intuitive. Right? So we actually get some deeper understanding about what's the story that's being offered by pushing it to these extremes and seeing what happens, or trying to reason about that. So that's why we're doing this stuff. I mean, I always have some students who are like, can't we use just real life examples? Why do we have to talk about God and all this crazy crap, science fiction crap? And the reason is because we need to push at the logical and conceptual boundaries of these theories. It's not just enough that we make accurate predictions under the context that are familiar to it. If we really want to understand the meaning of what this thing is saying and conceptually, then we have to look at all of the things that it conceptually entails. And it's usually at these crazier cases that our intuitions start to break down a little bit more. And that might be a good thing. Okay, so that's what I kind of wanted to say about that. There's a next phase to the dilemma here for the psychological continuity theory and this whole survival and stuff like that. And I want to take another pause here to see if there are some more questions before I dig into that next step. So let's see here. Who's the they that you're talking about, Daniel? Okay. Um, oh, I think I understand what you're asking. Um, so our topic here, we've been talking about objects like pens. I've been throwing pens around. We've been talking about that a whole bunch. Um, and I've been saying that we can ask questions about identity with regard to material objects, and then we also have questions when it comes to people, like beings like us. Um, and you might wonder, well, what counts as us? Like, how broad of a category is that? Um, Generally, I think we are sticking to, well, I'm okay. I know what we are sticking to this concept of persons, and persons is actually a fairly specific philosophical concept. When philosophers talk about people, or especially when they use this weirder version of people, persons, to say let's talk about persons instead of people, they mean to suggest by that beings that have the kind of inner conscious life that we do. So, or that you do. Like, you've got thoughts. You do things for reasons. You form intentions. You pursue those intentions with purposeful activity, that kind of thing. Any being who's got that kind of crap going on is a person. And a being that doesn't have that stuff going on, not a person. So, like, even if we've got a robot that walks around and does stuff, may not be a person because there may not be anything going on up there. It's just a bunch of mechanisms, a bunch of mechanical calculations. It's not done with any kind of spark of consciousness or understanding or something like that. I was having a conversation with some students today about, maybe it was yesterday, about a old-fashioned adding machine, which is just like a bunch of gears and pulleys, but it does mathematical calculations, and like a little wooden flap pops up with a number that's been drawn onto it, so you can like be like 2 plus 2, and then pull the crank, and then 4 comes up. Does the machine understand math? We're very tempted to say no, it doesn't. And if I have a really complicated version of just that basic machine, does that cross some sort of threshold here that puts it into the realm of consciousness? Maybe not. But people have a lot of conflicting intuitions about this. Some people speculate, and that's really all it is. It's just kind of a speculation. We can make some arguments for it, but there's no hard proof here. That maybe if a system becomes sufficiently complex, like the complexity that's involved in the neural structures of the brain, then consciousness just emerges as this extra property that shows up because of just the sufficient complexity. But I don't see there's not really a good explanation for why just more complexity is suddenly going to give rise to consciousness or something like that. If we're talking about animals, it seems like some animals are clearly persons. Like dolphins are clearly persons. Elephants are clearly persons. Maybe some other animals are clearly not persons, like a virus, not a person. A bacterium, not a person. Clam, probably not a person. Um, Then we start thinking about dogs and cats, and then we're like, tougher one, very tough one. Maybe some gray area here. So that's kind of a hard thing to figure out. But I think there's some clear-cut cases of yes, it's not just humans. There's other animals that have these kinds of features. And then there's other animals that were like, you just seem like a biological mechanism, whether there's any kind of consciousness present or not. It's weird. But there's also people who go on the other end of the spectrum here and think that even plants have consciousness. And it's not totally a cockamamie theory to say, yeah, plants have consciousness. There's some argument for that too. So this is an area of great speculation more than anything else. But we're not restricting personhood here to just humans by any means. I'm going to grab some water for a second. I'm all out of water. And maybe you guys think of more questions you want to ask. I'll be right back. Any questions before we go a little further? Okay. Okay. All right. And like we kind of happened in class this morning, there's a lot of things that come up, a lot of things that the different philosophical ideas that show up in this debate might raise a whole lot of other questions too, and they might not be uh, necessary or even like relevant to really exploring the philosophical topic that of personal identity that we're here to explore. But it doesn't mean that they're not interesting questions. And man, you guys know me, I love my tangents. So especially outside of class, I'm always down for tracking down those tangents if things are coming up and you are curious. Like, do philosophers have anything to say about this? What do they have to say? I might be able to give you a little bit of stuff, or at least point you to some resources that can tell you more than I can. Okay, there's one final step here in understanding the problem for the psychological continuity theory. And I think, given where we're at with time and everything, I am going to use this as a kind of seamless transition into talking a little bit about Parfit, because he really picks up right where this discussion leaves off. So remember, we were thinking about what is the psychological continuity theory of identity going to then say about the possibility of survival, of surviving the death of the body. And we were talking about how maybe God can make some other body and hook that body up in the right way, causally, to the me that has inhabited this earthly body that has since ceased functioning. Okay, so my consciousness is somehow like transferred and all the memory connections are authentic, and so that chain is intact between, like the chain, here, body dies right at that place, but then God hooks up, makes the connection here between the heavenly body and my earthly body that has since died, and so the chain is unbroken. Okay, so let's grant, for the sake of argument, I was saying that there might be some questions here about whether God's intervention here, especially in like what sort of power is he using or what sort of causal connection is he making. But there might be some questions about whether that's going to make for an authentic memory or not. But let's just grant, for the sake of argument, that he can do that. So, God makes for me a heavenly body, and it connects up with my earthly body's conscious stream in the way, everything that we want for authentic rememberings and blah blah blah. So as far as the psychological continuity theory goes, I survived as the heavenly body. But here's the problem. If God can do this once, then he can do it twice. So he makes a second heavenly body. So see, here we got the chain. My earthly body is going along, dies. God hooks up another one, but then he does a second one. What does this mean? So it seemed like I survived when we were looking at it as just one. But now we get into this crazy dilemma. If there's two of me, then what's going on? Do I survive as one of them? Do I survive as the other one? Do I survive as both? Or do I survive as neither? And there's dilemmas for each one of these things. Those are all the logical possibilities. There's no other options for how we could respond to this sort of scenario. I have to survive as one or the other, both or neither. There's no other alternative here, given all of our pre-theoretical intuitions about how identity is supposed to behave. Some of them Parfit is going to challenge when we get to him. So hang on to that. But if I choose the option, if I say you survived as one of them but not the other one's just like a clone or something. It's not really you. It's just a second person that's not you. It's not identical. Doesn't share identity with the earthly me, the earthly body Tim. The problem is showing some sort of reason why which one of them that I picked, why it's not utterly arbitrary. Because both of these things we're positing in the thought experiment are exactly the same. Like, God does the exact same thing he did in the first case with the second case. There's no real difference between them. Let's say he even does it simultaneously, so it's not like one came first and one came after. So there's really nothing for us to point to justify why we're going to pick one and not the other. That's the problem there. The problem with surviving as neither is that when we said that God made only one of them, if we only did one of them, then I did survive. But how come if he made a second one, like later or something, that now I didn't survive? That's really wacky. That doesn't make any sense. What accounts for the change? How can I go from surviving to not surviving just because God did something else in addition to what he first did? That seems pretty weird. But there's also a problem for saying I survive as both, because that goes against this singular notion about what identity is about. That numerical identity is always one. There's no number bigger than one. If there are two different me's, I can't be two people. That doesn't work. Each person has their own existence. They're their own person. Identity is always unified and singular. It's never multiple things. So each one of those things runs into conceptual absurdities, and that poses a problem for the theory as a whole. Remember how I described this argument style of reductio ad absurdum? That's what's going on here. That the argument with the objection against the psychological continuity theory would look like this. Okay, let's say psychological continuity theory is correct. Let's grant for the sake of argument that it's correct. Here's this crazy case of the Heaven twins. Psychological continuity theory, all the answers it could possibly give about that case are absurd. So the theory has generated an absurdity. Therefore, the theory must be wrong. There must be a problem with it, because it's not capable of giving a good answer to this. And because it can't give a good answer, it's a bad theory. That's the first thing that this particular issue of the Heaven twins, which actually Parfit's going to talk about another version of that same sort of dilemma that he calls the Wiggins case, and it's a little more maybe physically plausible than like this whole God sort of thing making Heaven twins. But for all practical purposes, it comes down exactly to the same conceptual difficulty for the psychological continuity theory. The first thing that Parfit really leads off with in his paper is challenging those intuitions that say, if we're going to have a good theory of personal identity, then it's got to be able to answer these certain weird cases, and it can't answer those things. So that's a problem. So yeah, that's where we're going to go next here with Parfit. Yeah, so I think I'm going to pause there for a second because I've had some comments here in the comment stream, and I want to take a look at them and read them and then maybe respond to them. And if there are any other questions that are coming up with that, then let's talk about that. But just as kind of like to finish up this little foreshadowing thing with Parfit. Parfit's going to be giving a really weird, wacky answer to what is personal identity, this whole personal identity question. But his basic proposal is a kind of derivative of the psychological continuity account, and he confronts head-on this major dilemma that all psychological continuity theories have. This issue about this duplicate thing ruining or generating a kind of logical paradox where the theory is not able to give a non-absurd answer. So that's where we're going to be. That's going to be the connection with Parfit. Okay. Well, it says I like to. If you. Okay, so here's what Lawrence said. I would think that if you take into account the same process by which some trees spread, and how a forest of trees is really one tree, then both could be considered the same person, therefore they would survive as both. Okay, here's the first thing. It might be important that in the psychological continuity theory, we're talking about consciousness as really being what a person is, this like stream of consciousness. So if trees are not a stream of consciousness sort of thing, then maybe what's going on with them is not going to be analogous to understanding what goes on with our identity, these conscious being sorts of things. That's the first sort of problem. But if we say, let's say that trees are conscious, so they are in the same sort of category as beings like us, and then they are this a bunch of trees, a whole forest of trees is really one single living organism, then we have to kind of imagine that the consciousness of that whole thing is unified as well. That here, this particular tree over here and this particular tree over here, there's like some sort of conscious recognition that's happening here and here, but it's all part of a unified thing. The same way that I might have like consciousness of what's happening over in this hand and happening over in this hand, but there's a way in which both of those experiences are brought into some kind of psychic unity up here in my brain, and I'm putting it all together, something like that. I think that still is not going to be a counterexample to what we're talking about with the Heaven Twins, because with the Heaven Twins, we've got two separate, divergent streams of consciousness that are then going off and doing off their own thing. Virib has a bunch of wonderful ways of articulating the absurdities that happen if we say that we survive as both. She says, okay, let's say that there's this sort of heaven duplicate thing, and in some ways they're like still mortal or something like that. Like God just gave you like an extra life sort of thing. It's still another body, but it could also be destroyed too. So say these two heaven duplicates face off in a duel, and one of them kills the other. Do we call it a suicide? I like that little pithy line. I think that is a good way of putting it into perspective. Because when we're talking about identity, I mean, these are the kinds of relationships that we're talking about. That if one of them killed the other, it wouldn't really be murder. It would be like self-murder. But that doesn't seem to fit right with what we might intuitively say about such an encounter like that. So I'm not sure whether this tree metaphor is really going to be helpful here, in as much as it doesn't maybe have that independent stream thing going on. If it does have the independent stream thing going on, then that's maybe reason to think that they aren't one single living organism, that they're a bunch of different living organisms that are just have their life processes involved with each other. Like say the tapeworm that lives in my gut. I don't have a tapeworm. I don't really have a tapeworm. But let's say I had this little critter inside of me that's like feeding off of my life energy or like the nutrients in my blood, something like that. The fact that its life processes are entwined with mine doesn't mean that we're the same person. Yeah, symbiote. Yeah. So that is another. If we take that path with the tree analogy, then that won't help either. So I hope that's making sense. Daniel asks, survival and identity do not need to mean the same thing. That is absolutely correct. And maybe you're getting that from Parfit a little bit here, that those things are maybe separate concepts. Parfit is going to tell us directly, explicitly in the paper, that he wants to explain a way in which I could survive without being the same person as the thing that survived, without it being me. That seems crazy. I mean, in terms of everything about how we're pre-theoretically thinking about personal identity, that sort of answer frustrates the hell out of it. It makes it into a kind of logical contradiction. So really, the only way out, if you're going to say something like that, if you're going to say survival and identity are not the same thing, then you're going to have to definitely grapple with the core pre-theoretical intuitions we have about the concept of personal identity. And that is exactly what Parfit wants to do. He wants to take those on head on. Ultimately, Parfit wants to say, who cares about personal identity? There's maybe no such thing. Let's not operate with that concept. That's not a concept we need to use. We can discard that concept. We can do everything that we would want a concept of personal identity to do without it. So why have it? So he's definitely going to be saying some counterintuitive and controversial claims here in how he's going to deal with the personal identity problem or the personal identity question. So we'll have to do more on that. I've got just a little bit of time left here if I'm going to keep this to an hour. And I kind of want to go back to the way that Parfit is sort of kicking off his paper here. So he, right in the intro paragraph, he says, there's two basic assumptions that we bring to the table when we're traditionally exploring the personal identity debate. One of them is that there are certain problems that our theories get into in these like wacky cases, like the Wiggins case or the Heavens twins sort of case. Especially for the psychological continuity theory, this is an issue. But we're also seeing how there's other dilemmas for the soul theory and the materialism theory too. Like, how is the soul theory going to deal with the possibility that my soul bowls are being swapped out all the time because I can't ever see them? And we had that dilemma. I don't know if we talked about. I don't think we did talk about this in class. But materialism has this question of like, how do I know that I'm the same person when I wake up in the morning? I don't check to see whether I have the same body. I'm still like there laying in bed and I'm like, oh, it's me again. I'm still the same being. How do I know that? If identity was about the body, then it seems like I'd have to check out my body and make sure it's the same in order to make that sort of judgment. So there's all these like little dilemmas that all the theories have. Like, what about under this circumstance? What about under that circumstance? What is it going to say? And so Parfit's the first assumption he wants to challenge is that in order to have a good theory of personal identity, we have to give an answer all the time to every possible situation that happens. You either are the same person or you're not the same person. There needs to be an answer. And that if we don't have that answer, we're not going to have a good theory of personal identity. So like if, in other words, these are the assumptions that cause us to conclude that if the psychological continuity theory can't give a good answer or a non-absurd answer to the Heaven twins case, that it's therefore a bad theory of identity and it should be discarded. And Parfit doesn't like that. He thinks maybe we can have some discussion about identity that isn't really universal. That's one thing that he's going to posit here by the end of the paper. The reason, the logic behind forcing each of these theories into these wacky thought experiments is saying, if I'm giving a theory of personal identity, I'm telling you about the essence of this thing. Every time someone is the same person as someone else, that they share identity, it happens on these terms. It's the same rule for everybody. It's not like there's a different condition of personal identity for you. For you, it's about the body, and for me, it's about a soul. That doesn't make sense. There's got to be like a universal answer. It's that sort of idea that leads us into these difficulties. And Parfit's going to suggest by the end of the paper that maybe for different types of beings, it would be appropriate to have different types of concepts of identity. But in doing that, he's really given up on the whole idea of there being some sort of essence or essential phenomenon of identity in the way that we normally talk about it. And this is one of the things that makes Parfit very difficult to read. And I definitely wanted to speak to let you know that you're not crazy if you are getting very, very confused by Parfit's paper. The thing that's confusing is that for about half of the paper, he's saying, let's get rid of the concept of identity. And then the other half of the paper, he's like, I'm going to redefine the concept of identity. Those things seem contradictory. I mean, if the whole point is that he's giving it up, then why is he talking about some other ways that we can think about identity? Here's the answer that I think might help you tease those things apart. It was kind of what I said just a second ago, but I'm going to repeat it and maybe attack it from a different direction. That might help it make more sense. Under the traditional way of thinking about identity, we're saying there's some real phenomenon here. There's like a real thing going on in reality where where there are people. There are these people objects, and they have a certain identity to them, and we just need to figure out what exactly in reality is mapped onto that phenomenon. What is sort of into that reality. When Parfit says that we should get rid of the concept of identity, he's saying we should give up on the idea that there is such a real reality. And what he's going to do instead is say, if we're going to still talk about identity, it's going to just be this kind of pragmatic concept. It's something that's going to do some work for us, that allows us to reason, to negotiate other types of things that are real phenomenon. But it's kind of like tongue-in-cheek. Like the whole time we're using this concept of identity, we're really knowing that there isn't such a thing. It's just a like convenient device that allows us to make things happen in this world in a kind of smooth way, that lets us negotiate all the things like taxes. Like, did you pay your taxes? Well, I'm going to have to think of some sort of idea of identity to make sure that everything's happening there with taxes in the right way. And under some of these wacky conditions, which are actually, like I was saying earlier, somewhat scientifically plausible, we'd have to figure out some way of being, of some way of negotiating who's going to pay their taxes and when. And to do that, we might come up with some notion of identity that fits with the circumstances of what kinds of beings we are. That's what Parfit's open to, but it's still just a convention. It's just it's an illusion that there's any real thing called identity. We just operate as if there was one because it's pragmatically useful and there's a benefit to it. That's it. So that's how he's able to like kind of talk out of two sides of his mouth here. In fact, when I'm lecturing on Parfit, I usually use this little convention of like when we're talking about the traditional way of thinking about personal identity. I'll just say it straightforward, like personal identity, like in a normal voice. But when we're talking about Parfit's weird pragmatic version of identity, then that's when I usually do this identity sort of thing. I'll speak in that kind of voice in order to clue you in about which notion of identity we're talking about. We're like, here's this concept of identity. Is it the concept that's supposed to represent that there's a real phenomenon, or is it a concept that's just a convenient fiction that we endorse in order to make life pleasant, or to like make it work smoothly? So hopefully that helps. As you guys are reading Parfit and getting ready for our discussion of him on Monday, maybe those comments will help. There's some other comments going on here in the group chat. I think I might save those for after the lecture is over here and jump in on the conversation. There's actually, I kind of want to give you guys one more thing of help with Parfit before we sign off tonight. And by the way, gosh, I always forget to do this. I always want to do it sooner. Let's have the code word tonight be in keeping with our theme. It'll be Utah Raptor. Utah Raptor. That's this guy. It's like the state of Utah plus Raptor. Okay, so that's the code word for tonight. Okay. Okie dokes. The last little help with Parfit that I want to give you guys is, I think I might have put this in the reading notes, but I want to remind you about it. Parfit does all this lead in with the Wiggins case and sort of framing where the discussion has been traditionally and what's sort of problematic about that. And then it's really on, once he gets into section 2, the very end of section 2, that he's going to lay out a game plan here for how he wants to treat the notion of personal identity. The real conclusion he wants to convince us of is that we can ditch the concept of identity. And he's got these 3 claims here that he'll use to justify that move to us, because that's a really crazy move to just say, yeah, I know you think you've got this intuition like there's this whole identity thing, but that's really just a lie. It's not. There's really nothing like that. It's just an illusion. That's kind of hard for us to swallow. I mean, just ask yourself, can I really buy the idea that there's no such thing as me? It's kind of counterintuitive. It's kind of hard to swallow that. So if we are going to do that, we better have some pretty gosh darn good reasons for doing it. So here's what Parfit thinks he needs to prove in order to make that happen. And I'm going to draw a little quick picture, and this is it. I promise I'll sign off after this, at least for the long video that you have to watch. And I'm going to do this really, really quickly. So this goes back with what I was talking about at the very beginning of our discussion of personal identity. So here's this concept, personal identity, and the reason we want to talk about it is because there's some theoretical motives that sort of brought this to our attention, like the issue of survival, or the one I'm going to talk about a lot with Parfit is moral responsibility. It seems like if we're going to talk about these concepts, they automatically get us into discussion about personal identity. So if I've got a question about whether or not I'm going to survive the death of my body, I need to know what's the me that's supposed to be surviving. And then a theory is supposed to explain personal identity so I can get a sense of what makes me me, and then I'll be able to maybe start talking about whether or not I can survive. Okay, so there are these three theoretical objects that are getting connected with each other. There's the original questions that provoke the question about identity, and then there's the different answers that the theory gives about what is identity so we can answer these questions. Okay, Parfit's strategy is he wants to get rid of, this is the way I like to call it, he wants to get rid of the middleman. That's the whole goal here. He wants to say, look, I can talk about these questions, these philosophical issues, these real phenomenon that we're worried about, like life and death and survival and moral responsibility, just directly in terms of whatever sorts of things this theory is talking about. So say the psychological continuity theory. Psychological continuity is a phenomenon. We can talk about that. Memory relations, we can talk about that. Maybe we could use these to just explain these kinds of questions directly without funneling through this concept of personal identity, which, as we've seen, is loaded with all this baggage of these pre-theoretical concepts that we think personal identity is involved in. And that's really what Parfit thinks makes for trouble in these like Heaven twin cases or the Wiggins case. That it's all the baggage about how we're trying to get an answer to fit with this concept of personal identity that makes for the problem. But maybe we can just eliminate the problematic middleman and get an answer to these questions directly from the theories that we were considering before as theories of identity. We can just be like, whatever they were talking about, let's just use those to answer these questions. And the steps that Parfit's going to need to do to accomplish that kind of defense, he gives at the very end of section 2. So he's very straightforward with it. He's like, I got 3 claims to prove, and I'm going to prove them to you in reverse order. Here, I'll read them to you. The 3 claims Parfit wants to defend is a sense of survival that does not imply identity. So in other words, a way in which I could survive, but there's no talk of me being the same person as the thing that survived. Okay? The next thing he wants to prove to us is that things that matter in terms of survival are relations of degrees, and that these relations can be understood in a way that doesn't presuppose identity. And so he's going to do those in reverse order. Okay, so by showing us that there are relationships that can be understood without presupposing identity, like say memory, that's going to be the big one. We can talk about memory in a way that doesn't presuppose identity. Then show that what matters in survival is stuff that is just a matter of degree. It's not an on-off sort of thing like personal identity is forcing it to be. Then he thinks, albeit from those things, he'll be able to show that there is a sense of survival that doesn't rely on any sort of notion of personal identity. And once he can prove that, then it's sort of like all the theoretical usefulness of personal identity has been able to be thrown out. It's been able to be accomplished without personal identity. There's no need, like personal identity is not adding anything to our theoretical understanding of these phenomena. So what's the point in continuing to endorse it as a real existing phenomenon? He thinks there isn't one, so we can discard it. That's the game plan in a nutshell. It's a very unorthodox strategy, and it definitely is counterintuitive, and it's definitely weird, and it's hard to get your mind around at times. But that's going to be our main ambition for next Monday, is to try to get straight on Parfit, and hopefully we can get done with that on Monday and move on to some more material. But I'll be giving you guys a weekend update about all that stuff, and we'll sort out what happens next week. So this is our first real experiment with flexible scheduling, and let's see how it goes. Okay. Thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you next time.